Hello. You're listening to Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives, where we bring you stories about people, places, and events from Mennonite history. I'm your host, Dan Dyck.
Dear Mrs. Penner, our religious vows forbids us from becoming interested in the other sex, but they do not prevent us from admiring female human beings.
That was Steve Penner reading an excerpt from a letter a priest wrote to his mom, Olga Penner. We'll hear more from that letter later on in today's show. Olga Penner is perhaps better known as Aunt Olly to an entire generation of children. As we learned from last week's episode, Olga Penner was a teacher, a media personality, and a literacy advocate with an influential public voice. She worked for Altona-based radio station CFAM from 1959 until her retirement in 1987. But who was Olga Penner when she was off the air? I recently spoke with her sons, Steve and David, to paint a picture of who Olga Penner was beyond her radio persona. As a mom, Olga Penner sewed all the clothes her two sons wore and was a stickler for good manners. Steve and David were to chew with their mouths closed, keep their elbows off the table, and treat everyone with respect. She taught the boys how to properly set a table and iron their clothes. But more importantly to Steve and David, she was an extremely caring person for family and stranger alike.
She was a very good listener. There were never times where we didn't feel very comfortable going to her with whatever, issues we were dealing with. She was very compassionate. I recall during beet weeding season when, a lot of the folks from the reserve came over to work in the fields. They came into town often, asking for food or selling the wares of various kinds. And we had various rugs, braided rugs made out of nylon stockings that were being sold by these folks. And then, she often fed whole families in the backyard. Our house was very small, so a picnic table accommodated the numbers and just made sandwiches and food and drinks for entire families.
Steve recalls that some of their guests became regular visitors.
I remember the first time two women came to the door, and they had kids with them. And Mom said, are you hungry? Come to the backyard. We've got a picnic table. I'll make you all lunch. And they became more frequent visitors, always with a whole group of kids. And she busily made sandwiches for everybody. She was very, very kind and always took time for people. And, that's certainly something that was very, very evident to us from a very early age, that she always took time for whether it was friends or neighbors or people coming to the door. She took time for them.
Regular listeners who had never met Olly could come across as overfamiliar, said Steve and David.
Part of that came from the fact that a lot of people who listened to her on a very, very regular basis felt that they knew her. And she had a calm and comforting way about her that set people at ease. So when they would meet her in the store or downtown, they already felt they knew her, even if she didn't have any idea who they were. She spent time with them.
Everybody she interacted with, in my view, especially as a child and even an adult, was always treated like the most important person in that moment. And, we were talking about a situation yesterday where she had met a woman in the mall, and the woman was quite difficult to understand, but Mom, listened and interacted and even responded. And then as my sister-in-law and Mom walked away, my sister-in-law asked, well, who was that woman? And Mom said, I don't have a clue who that was, but she treated her as if it was a close relative. Always, everybody like that.
When CFAM offered Olly a job, she was confronted with the choice of returning to her teaching career or becoming a broadcaster.
So Mom, after consideration and discussion with certainly our dad, went back and said, you know what, I'll be interested in the job if I can have certain hours that mesh with my boys in school. And so when we got home from school, she was home already. When we had the summers off, she had the summers off. And she had hours that were complementary to our hours and allowed her to be home with us. And a lot of her critics didn't realize that at the time. They weren't familiar with pre-recorded programming. They thought everything was live. And so the situation was, in fact, a little different than they perceived it to be.
She got criticism for not being at home with her family when, in fact, she was home with her family. But that was a little tough at times, when you get criticized for something that's really not the truth.
Did it make a difference to us as kids at home? No, it didn't. We didn't really notice any difference, even after she started work.
Having a trained educator for a mom proved to be a disadvantage for David.
She was so pleasant to listen to and read to us every day. We always were read to by our mother in that voice. And with that kind of resource right at home, I didn't start reading books till I was in junior high. There was no need. She read all the books we were interested in to us in a way that was way smoother, the inflection that we weren't able to do at a young age. So, yeah, books were very important. We were always surrounded by books, both our parents. There were books of all kinds all the time. But as for, motivating us to read, just the opposite.
I asked the brothers if they ever listened to their mother's children's party program on the radio. Steve skillfully diverted the question.
One of the things that would often happen when we'd be out in the community or even in Winnipeg somewhere, somebody would inevitably come up to us and say, oh, and I'll speak personally, somebody would say, oh, are you Aunt Olly's son? And I would say, yes, I am. And one woman in particular, I remember her asking, do you ever listen to your mother? And upon asking the question, realizing the humor that was intertwined with that wording, I kind of chuckled and said, well, probably not as often as I should have.
David offers a more direct response with a follow-up from Steve.
She was a person to be listened to at home, that's for sure. But no, I didn't listen either. We, like Steve said, we had her at home all the time.
Her radio voice was the same as at home. That was just who she was. She didn't put on airs. She didn't put on a radio voice, as some people do. It was her everyday voice.
Steve and David say they were never bothered by having a local celebrity for their mom, even though many people stopped to meet, greet, and visit with her when they were out in public. Their father, Vic, who was a newspaper editor at the Red River Valley Echo, was happy to be in the shadow of their mom's public profile, which led to Steve standing up for his dad on one occasion.
He quite willingly let Mom take the limelight and was happy to step back when people approached her and wanted to converse in a more personal way. At one point, I remember being a little pointed with a response that I had to somebody who had approached me once again and said, oh, are you Aunt Olly's son? And I said, yes, and Uncle Vic's too. Because I felt at that point it was a little bit just my mom. And my dad was such an integral part of who she was in terms of the support he gave her always. The material that he had cross his desk was significant, but he always looked at it in terms of, yes, can I use it in the newspaper, but could it apply to something on radio for Mom to use?
In addition to a busy radio career, Olly was a busy contributor in the community. But she didn't let her busy career get in the way of being a parent.
Well, she was the Sunday school superintendent at Eltona Mennonite Church. She was in the church choir as you mentioned, wrote articles for the local paper. She was a lifetime member of the Women's Institute, a very active group at the time. She was MC for a lot of community Sunflower Festival type programs, 4-H judge. It just goes on and on. Yeah, she was always there for us.
Both of the brothers' parents were lifelong learners. Vic studied journalism, they took Spanish lessons together, and in her 70s, Ollie moved a piano into the house so she could learn how to play. And family vacations weren't just getaways. They were learning opportunities, too.
With the heavy schedules that they had, and with the fact that she always had time for family, she always made sure that she was available to us. When it came down to holiday time, whether it was down to Minneapolis or whether it was out west or out east, west was family, east was family. It was always punctuated with stops at any historic site or any museum or gallery, and always, knowing Dad, always reading every single line of text and copy that was available.
Ollie received many letters from kids who listened to her, but adults sometimes responded to her children's party program as well. One such letter especially stood out for her.
There was one letter that she particularly enjoyed. It was a communication from a Catholic priest. And he says, "Dear Mrs. Penner, our religious vows forbids us from becoming interested in the other sex, but they do not prevent us from admiring female human beings. St. Francis of Assisi once said, quote, 'Be thou blessed, O Lord, for having created our sisters of the opposite sex so sweet and charming,' unquote. I think of this quote often when I hear your quiet, soothing, serene, and perfectly clear voice on the radio. Then instead of being 55, one of the fives vanishes and I am young again."
Olga Penner's broadcast career had a lasting impact on many of her listeners.
There was one situation that I found particularly interesting when she was probably in her early 80s. She suddenly got a letter that was simply addressed Aunt Olly, Altona, Manitoba, Canada. There was nothing else on it. She opened up the letter, and it was a letter sent to her from a woman in Alaska. And the woman wanted to send, Mum had always wanted to write her, but it finally had come down to the point where she was determined to send a letter of admiration and appreciation for the years Mum had been on the radio, and just to indicate to Mum how important she had been to her as a girl growing up in southern Manitoba. And so she wrote this lovely letter to Mum and said, "I have no idea if you're still alive or if you're still living in Altona, but I'm sending this letter with the hopes that you're still around and will get it." So she just sent it to Aunt Olly, Altona, Manitoba. And fortunately, in a small town, the post office not only knew who Aunt Olly was, but they knew Aunt Olly's post box number. So they got the letter into the box and Mum got it.
The Mennonite Heritage Archives holds materials from Olga Penner's career, including her scrapbook, which contains photos, letters, and drawings from her fans. To see some of these images, or to listen to this episode again, visit mharchives.ca online. If you have questions or comments about this program, email us at info@mharchives.ca.
Hello, I'm Conrad Stace, archivist at the MHA. Thanks for listening to Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives. Thanks also to our partners, Canadian Mennonite University, the Centre for Transnational Mennonite Studies, and Mennonite Church Canada. This program is made possible through support from Golden West Radio and listeners like you. If you want to support the program and the work of the archives, you can find out how to do that on our website, mharchives.ca, and click on Support.
I'm your host, Dan Dyck. Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives will be back next week with another story about people, places, and events from Mennonite history. Thanks for listening.